There, huddled against the rusted metal of the bus stop bench across the street, were two figures so fragile they looked like they might simply dissolve into the gray November mist. They weren't just cold, they were collapsing. The man, his spine curved like a question mark, had his arms wrapped tight around a woman whose head was buried in the threadbare wool of his lapel. Even from behind the safety of my glass barrier, I could see the rhythmic, desperate shaking of his shoulders. It wasn't the shivering of a body fighting the frost. It was the unmistakable, soul-deep shuddering of a man who had reached the end of his tether. I stood frozen, my own reflection staring back at me from the pain. A woman aged prematurely by 3 years of widowhood, my hair pulled back in a fraying tie, my skin sallow from the relentless cycle of double shifts and broken sleep. My lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache, a reminder of the industrial floor buffers I'd pushed for 8 hours before coming home to a cold house. I looked at my hands, the knuckles red and the skin split near the nails from the harsh lye I used to keep the office buildings downtown sparkling for people who never saw me. I had nothing to give. My bank account was a graveyard of insufficient funds notices, and the pantry held little more than generic pasta and a half loaf of bread I was saving for Leo and Mia's school lunches. But as I watched the elderly woman lift her head, her face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles slick with tears, I saw a reflection of a pain I knew too well. It was the look of the abandoned. The bus roared past them, kicking up a slushy spray of gray sleet that soaked their shoes, and it didn't even slow down. They didn't even flinch. It was as if they expected the world to spit on them. I thought of Elias. I thought of the way he used to hold my face in his warm, calloused hands and tell me that as long as we had a roof, we were kings. He's been gone 3 years, and the crown has felt more like a lead weight every single day since. Mom, who are you looking at? Leo's voice, cracking with the awkward transition of 15, drifted from the hallway. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I watched the old man reach into his pocket and pull out a crumpled tissue, trying to wipe his wife's eyes with hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped it. They looked like they were waiting for a miracle that had long ago forgotten their address. A sudden fierce heat rose in my chest, a defiance against the cold that had been settling into my own bones. I wasn't just a widow. I wasn't just a janitor or a tired mother. I was a witness. I set the tea down, the liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the formica, and moved toward the door. My boots were by the mat, the soles worn thin, but I didn't care. I grabbed my heaviest coat, the one Elias had bought me for our last anniversary, and shoved my feet into my shoes without tying the laces. The silence of the house, which usually felt like a suffocating shroud, suddenly felt like a call to action. I couldn't fix the hole in my heart, and I couldn't bring Elias back to take the weight off my shoulders, but I would be damned if I let those two people drown in the freezing rain while I watched from a dry kitchen. I threw open the deadbolt, the cold air hitting me like a physical blow, and stepped out into the storm. The sleet didn't just fall, it bit. It felt like thousands of tiny needles stitching themselves into my skin as I scrambled across the asphalt, the laces of my boots slapping against the wet ground. The streetlights cast long, sickly shadows that danced in the puddles, making the world feel like a charcoal sketch that was slowly being erased by the rain. By the time I reached the curb across from my house, my breath was coming in ragged plumes of white, and the heavy wool of my coat, Elias' coat, was already beginning to drink the moisture, weighing me down. I didn't stop. I couldn't. If I hesitated for even a second, the logic of my bank account and the exhaustion in my marrow would scream loud enough to make me turn back. They didn't see me until I was standing right in front of them. Up close, they looked even more fragile, like two porcelain figurines that had been dropped and glued back together too many times. The man looked up first. His eyes were a watery, faded blue. The whites turned a jaundiced yellow by age and perhaps something worse. He didn't look afraid, he looked ashamed. That was the thing that hit me the hardest, the shame. It was a weight I carried every time I had to put back a gallon of milk at the register, a phantom limb that throbbed whenever the kids asked for new shoes. "Sir," I said, my voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. I reached out, my hand hovering near his shoulder, not quite touching the damp wool of his coat. "Sir, the last bus for the night passed 20 minutes ago. It isn't coming back." The woman didn't look up. She was still tucked into his chest, her small, gloveless hands clutching that plastic bag like a holy relic. I could see the contents now through the thin white film: a loaf of bread, a tin of generic soup, and what looked like a framed photograph, its glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern. "We know," the man whispered. His voice was a dry rattle, the sound of dead leaves skittering across a driveway. We're just resting a moment, miss. We'll be moving on." "Moving on where?" I asked. The question felt like a trap. I knew the answer. There was nowhere to move on to in this neighborhood unless you had a key or a death wish. He didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the woman, his knuckles white and trembling. I looked back at my house. Through the living room window, I could see the soft, amber glow of the lamp and the silhouette of Leo standing by the glass, his forehead pressed against the pane. He was watching me. He was watching the world break right in front of our doorstep. I thought about the half loaf of bread in my pantry. I thought about the drafty spare room that we used for storing the boxes of Elias things, the things I couldn't bring myself to sell or throw away. "It's too cold for this," I said, more to myself than to them. "You're going to freeze." The woman finally lifted her head. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated grief. "They took the house," she sobbed, the sound so thin it was almost lost to the wind. "They changed the locks while we were at the clinic. 40 years and they changed the locks." The man hushed her, his own eyes filling with a fresh layer of tears. "Hush, Martha, don't bother the lady. She's got her own troubles, you can see it in her eyes." He was right. I did have my own troubles. I had a mortgage that was 3 months behind and a car that was one pothole away from the scrap heap. But as I looked at Martha's blue-tinged lips, I realized that the only thing worse than having nothing was having no one to see you having nothing. "My name is Sarah," I said, reaching down and taking the man's hand. His skin was like ice, a terrifying, deep-set cold that seemed to seep right into my own palm. "And you aren't staying out here. Come on, my house is just across the street." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering from me to the warm glow of my window and back again. "We can't. We don't want to be a burden, Sarah." "The burden is the cold," I replied, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I still possessed. "The rest we can figure out inside, please." I didn't wait for another protest. I hooked my arm under his, helping him stand. He was lighter than a child, his bones feeling like dry kindling beneath his coat. Together, we managed to get Martha onto her feet. She clung to the plastic bag as if it were her only anchor to the earth. We moved like a slow, wounded animal across the street, the three of us huddled together against the onslaught of the sleet. Every step felt like a victory against the darkness that had been trying to swallow me whole since the funeral. As we reached my porch, the door swung open before I could even reach for the handle. Leo stood there, his eyes wide, taking in the sight of his mother hauling two strangers out of the night. He didn't ask questions. He didn't roll his eyes or complain about the cold air rushing into the hallway. He simply stepped back, holding the door wide, his face mirroring the same grim understanding I'd felt moments ago. "Leo, get the heater in the living room turned up," I commanded, my voice crisp. "And find those old blankets from the hall closet, the heavy ones." "On it, Mom," he said, already moving. I led them into the kitchen, the warmth of the house hitting us like a physical embrace. The smell of the tea I'd left on the counter, bergamot and honey, lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the scent of wet pavement and despair we'd brought in with us. I helped them into the mismatched wooden chairs at the small table, their movements stiff and painful. Martha wouldn't let go of the bag. She sat it on her lap, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone to come in and demand to see her papers. "I'll make some soup," I said, my mind already racing through the inventory of the cabinets. I had 1 can of tomato soup and a box of crackers. It wasn't a feast, but it was warm. And some fresh tea. Just breathe for a minute, you're safe now." The man, whose name I later learned was Arthur, looked at me with a bewildered kind of gratitude that made my throat ache. He reached out and touched the edge of the Formica table, his fingers tracing a scratch in the surface. "Thank you," he whispered. We thought we were invisible." "No one is invisible," I said, though I knew it was a lie. I'd felt invisible for 3 years. I turned to the stove, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the can opener. I wasn't sure how I was going to feed 2 extra mouths or where they would sleep or what the neighbors would say. All I knew was that for the first time since Elias died, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The silence hadn't been broken, it had been filled. The metallic click of the can opener was the only sound in the kitchen for a long moment, a sharp, rhythmic punctuation to the heavy silence of the room. I watched the lid peel back, revealing the deep, vibrant red of the tomato soup. It was a humble thing, a staple of a pantry that had seen better days, but as the steam began to rise from the pot, it felt like an offering. I added a splash of milk to stretch it further, whisking it slowly until the color paled to a soft, comforting orange. Across the room, Leo returned, draped in the heavy wool blankets my mother had given us years ago. He moved with a quiet grace I hadn't seen in him for months, draped one over Arthur's thin shoulders, and then knelt to wrap the other around Martha's legs. He didn't say a word, but the way he tucked the edges under her feet was more eloquent than any speech. Martha's hands finally began to unclench from the plastic bag. She set it on the floor beside her chair, her fingers trembling so violently they looked like pale, frantic birds. I brought 2 bowls to the table, the ceramic warm against my palms. I didn't have enough for 4, so I set them in front of our guests. Leo caught my eye, a silent question in his gaze, and I gave him a small, tight nod. We would eat later or not at all, it didn't matter. "Eat slowly," I whispered, placing a sleeve of crackers between them. "It's hot." Arthur took a spoonful, his hand shaking so much that some of the liquid slopped back into the bowl, but the look of pure relief that crossed his face when the warmth hit his tongue was almost too much to bear. Martha didn't move at first. She just stared into the steam as if she were looking into a crystal ball, seeing a future that had been stolen from her. "They didn't even let us take the medicine," she said, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Arthur's heart pills, my insulin. They said the sheriff's order was final, that we'd had 30 days, but the mail has been so confusing since the office closed." Arthur reached over, covering her hand with his. His skin was still deathly pale, the blue veins standing out like ink on parchment. "We thought we had more time, Sarah. We were waiting for the appeal. We've lived in that house since the year the highway was finished. I planted the oak tree in the front yard when it was no bigger than a walking stick. I leaned against the counter, the cold from the window behind me seeping through my uniform, but my heart was beginning to burn with a slow, steady heat. I looked at the stack of envelopes sitting on my own microwave, the ones with the red past due stamps, the ones I'd been ignoring because looking at them made my lungs feel like they were collapsing. I was only a few months behind them. A few bad weeks, a few more missed shifts, and I'd be the one standing on a corner with my life in a plastic bag. "Why today?" I asked, my voice thick. "Why in the middle of a storm?" "Because people don't look out their windows when it's snowing," Arthur said simply. He took another sip of soup, his strength seeming to return in small, agonizing increments. "It's easier to disappear when the world is white. No witnesses, just a lock and a piece of paper." Leo sat on the stool by the breakfast bar, his chin resting in his hands, watching them with a look of profound, unshielded empathy. He was seeing the end of a life, the brutal machinery of a world that didn't care about 40 years of memories or the shade of an oak tree. "You're staying here tonight," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. I didn't know where they would sleep, maybe the sofa, maybe Leo's bed while he took the floor, but the thought of them back out in that wind was an impossibility. "We can't pay you," Martha whispered, finally lifting her spoon. "We have nothing left but what's in that bag. A few photos. My mother's wedding ring. A change of socks." "I don't want your money, Martha," I said, and for the first time in 3 years I felt a sense of purpose that didn't involve just surviving the next hour. "I want you to be warm, the rest. The rest we'll figure out when the sun comes up." The wind rattled the window pane, a fierce howling reminder of the darkness just inches away, but inside, the light of the kitchen felt like a fortress. I watched Arthur reach for a cracker, his movements slightly steadier, and I knew that whatever happened tomorrow, tonight we had held the line. We were no longer invisible. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I'd grown used to since Elias died. It was a shared silence, the kind that exists between people who have all looked into the abyss and decided, for one night, to look at each other instead. I moved to the sink, beginning to rinse the pot, my mind already turning over the possibilities. I had a little bit of savings hidden in a jar, emergency money I'd been hoarding for the day the car finally gave up. It wasn't much, maybe $200, but as I looked at the two of them huddled under my mother's blankets, I realized that some emergencies didn't involve engines or tires. Some emergencies were about the very soul of who we were. "Leo," I said softly, not turning around. "Go get the air mattress from the garage and see if you can find your dad's old flannel shirts. They'll be too big, but they're warm." "I'm on it, Mom," he replied, his voice sounding older, surer. As he disappeared down the hall, I turned back to the table. Arthur was looking at me, his eyes wet and bright. "You're a good woman, Sarah, your husband. He must have been very proud of you." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a needle of grief that usually would have laid me low, but this time it felt different. "He was," I said, and for once I didn't follow it with the thought of how much I'd lost. Instead, I thought about what I still had. I had a roof. I had a son who understood the value of a blanket, and I had the sudden, terrifying, and exhilarating realization that I wasn't going to let these people fall. "Martha," I said, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from them. "Tell me about the house. Tell me everything. Who holds the mortgage? What's the name of the clinic you were at?" She looked startled, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. "Why, it's gone, dear. They changed the locks." "Locks can be changed back," I said, my voice dropping into a low, fierce register I hadn't used in years. "And papers can be challenged." But first, I need to know exactly who we're fighting. Arthur and Martha exchanged a glance, a look of tentative, flickering hope that was more painful to see than their tears. They had been discarded by the world, but they hadn't been forgotten by me. As the storm continued to rage outside, blurring the lines between the road and the sky, the four of us sat in that small, yellow-lit kitchen, and the plan began to take shape. It was a desperate plan, born of shared poverty and a refusal to be broken. But as I listened to them talk, the fear that had been my constant companion began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I was a widow with a failing car and a bank account that was a joke, but I was still standing. And as long as I was standing, I would be a wall between them and the wind. By the time the soup was gone and the air mattress was hissed into fullness in the living room, the clock on the wall read nearly midnight. Leo had brought down the flannel shirts, and Arthur looked swallowed by Elia's old buffalo check pattern, but the color was finally returning to his cheeks. Martha had allowed me to help her into the bathroom, where she washed her face with my lavender soap, her movements slow and reverent. "It smells like heaven," she whispered, drying her face with a frayed towel. "It's just soap," I said, though I knew it was more. It was dignity. It was the reminder that she was a person who deserved to be clean and scented and safe. When they were finally settled on the air mattress, tucked under a mountain of quilts, the house grew quiet again. Leo had retreated to his room, but I stayed in the kitchen, sitting in the dark with a single candle burning on the table. The electricity flickered once, a warning from the storm, but held. I reached for the plastic bag Martha had been carrying. She told me I could look through it for the documents they'd managed to grab. I pulled out a handful of papers, crinkled, water-stained, and smelling of old paper and desperation. There were bank statements, a notice of foreclosure, and a series of letters from a legal firm I recognized. They were the same ones who had handled the probate for Elias' meager estate, a firm that specialized in the efficient resolution of assets. In other words, they were vultures, but tucked between a photo of a young Arthur in a military uniform and a pressed flower was something else. It was a deed, old and yellowed, with a legal description that didn't match the one on the foreclosure notice. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd spent 3 years reading fine print and fighting for every cent of survivors' benefits. I knew how to spot a discrepancy. I leaned closer to the candle, the light dancing across the page. The foreclosure was for the house at 412 Maple, but the deed mentioned a parcel of land that included the adjacent lot, something about an easement that had been granted in 1978. If the bank had seized the house but not the land it sat on, or if the legal description was flawed, they might have jumped the gun. It was a slim hope, a thread of a chance, but it was enough. I sat there for a long time, watching the snow pile up against the door, the silence of the house breathing around me. I thought about the speechless move the local rumors would eventually talk about, the way a woman with nothing had taken in two people with less. But they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know that when you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. I looked at the phone on the wall. Tomorrow morning, I would start making calls. I would call the clinic, I would call the bank, and if I had to, I would call the local news station. I would use every ounce of the grit I'd developed while scrubbing floors and working double shifts to make sure that Arthur and Martha weren't just a footnote in a corporate ledger. I blew out the candle, the scent of wax lingering in the dark. As I walked toward my bedroom, I passed the living room where the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the two guests filled the space. It was the sound of life continuing. It was the sound of a house that was no longer empty. The next morning broke with a blinding, crystalline light. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a foot of pristine, treacherous snow. I woke before the sun, my mind already buzzing with the list of things I needed to do. I dressed in my warmest clothes, the heavy work boots I'd kept from Elia's closet feeling solid and grounding on my feet. In the kitchen, I found Leo already up. He was sitting at the table, a notebook open in front of him. He'd been doing research on his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "Mom," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the couple in the next room. "I looked up that law firm. They've done this before. There's a whole forum of people in the county who say they were pushed out on technicalities. They target elderly people who don't have kids to check the paperwork." I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Then we're going to be their kids," I said. I spent the next 3 hours on the phone. I used my professional voice, the one I used when I had to talk to the insurance companies about Elias' medical bills. It was a voice that didn't take no for an answer, a voice that demanded to speak to supervisors and cited dates and times with surgical precision. By 10 o'clock, I had found out two things. First, the clinic Martha mentioned hadn't just been for a checkup. Arthur had been undergoing a series of tests for a heart condition that the bank's insurance wing was aware of. Second, the lock change had happened 4 days before the legal eviction date listed on the county website. They had broken the law to beat the storm. "Arthur, Martha," I said as they emerged from the living room looking dazed and fragile in the morning light. "Get your coats on. We're going for a drive." "Where?" Arthur asked, clutching his flannel shirt closed at the throat. "To your house," I said, "and then to the sheriff's office." The drive was slow, the car groaning as it pushed through the unplowed streets. Arthur and Martha sat in the back holding hands, their eyes fixed on the passing landscape as if they were seeing it for the last time. When we turned onto Maple Street, the sight was enough to make my blood boil. A bright yellow repossessed sign was taped to the front door of their charming, if slightly weathered, cottage. The oak tree Arthur had mentioned stood like a sentinel in the yard, its branches heavy with ice. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching over the frozen slush. Before I could even turn off the engine, a white SUV with a corporate logo on the side pulled up behind us. A man in a sharp wool coat stepped out, a clipboard in his hand. He looked like the kind of man who had never had a callus in his life. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice echoing in the crisp air. "This is private property." I stepped out of the car, slamming the door with a finality that made him blink. I felt Leo step up beside me, his presence a silent, solid weight. "Actually," I said, walking toward him, "this is the residence of Arthur and Martha Vance, and you are in violation of a stay of execution order that was filed this morning." It was a bluff. I hadn't filed the order yet, but I had the papers from the bag in my hand, and I had the fury of a woman who had seen too much taken from too many people. The man's eyes flickered to the elderly couple still sitting in the car. They were evicted. The 30 days were up. "The 30 days are up on Friday," I said, stepping into his personal space. I was shorter than him, but in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. "And you changed the locks while they were at a medical appointment." "That's an illegal lockout. In this state, that carries a heavy fine and immediate restoration of premises. Now you can either open that door right now, or we can wait for the sheriff, who I've already called." I hadn't called the sheriff yet either, but I had my thumb hovering over the dial on my phone. The man looked at the papers in my hand, then at the past due stamps on my own mail that I'd accidentally brought along in the stack. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the lack of fear. He saw a woman who had nothing left to lose, and that was the one thing a man like him didn't know how to handle. "I don't have the keys," he stammered, his bravado beginning to crack. "The contractor has them." "Then you better call the contractor," I said. "Because it's 5 degrees out here and these people are going inside." He hesitated, looking back at his warm SUV, and then at the fierce, unyielding set of my jaw. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. As he walked away to make the call, I turned back to the car. Arthur was looking at me through the window, his mouth open in a silent O of wonder. Martha was weeping, but these weren't the frozen tears of the night before. These were tears of hope. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of standing in the cold, of arguing with 3 different middle managers on the phone, and finally the arrival of a weary-looking sheriff's deputy who looked at the paperwork, looked at the shivering elderly couple, and then looked at the man in the wool coat with a look of pure disgust. "Open the door," the deputy said, "or I'm citing you for an illegal lockout right here, right now." The contractor arrived 10 minutes later. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. As the door swung open, the warmth of the house, still lingering from the furnace that had been left on, spilled out onto the porch. Arthur and Martha stepped over the threshold, their movements hesitant, as if they expected the walls to vanish if they touched them. I stayed on the porch, watching them. I didn't need to go inside. This wasn't my victory, it was theirs. But as I turned to walk back to my car, the man in the wool coat stopped me. "You realize this is only a temporary fix, right?" He sneered, his voice low so the deputy wouldn't hear. "They still owe the money. They'll be out again in a month. You can't save everyone, lady." I stopped and looked at him. I thought about my own mortgage. I thought about the car that was currently idling with a worrying rattle. And then I thought about the way Arthur had looked at me when I'd given him a bowl of soup. "Maybe not," I said, "but I saved them today. And tomorrow I'm going to help them find a lawyer who works pro bono. And the day after that, I'm going to help them apply for the senior tax exemption they didn't know they qualified for." I stepped closer, my voice a whisper that cut like the wind. "And if you come back here before the legal date, I'll be waiting. And I won't just have papers next time. I'll have the whole neighborhood." He didn't say anything else. He just got into his SUV and drove away, the tires spitting slush. When I got back into my car, Leo was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen since his father was alive. It was pride, yes, but it was also a kind of awakening. He saw that power didn't come from money or status. It came from the willingness to stand in the gap for someone else. "What now, Mom?" he asked. I looked at the house, where Martha was already standing at the window, waving a shaky hand at us. "Now," I said, putting the car in gear, "we go home and figure out how to pay our own bills. But first, I think we have some leftover crackers. I'm starving." We drove away, the sun reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that was almost blinding. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to fade into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But for the first time in 3 years, the exhaustion didn't feel like a weight. It felt like the tiredness of a day well spent. As we pulled into our own driveway, I saw the past due notices sitting on the dash. I picked them up, but I didn't feel the usual surge of panic. Instead, I felt a strange, quiet confidence. I had faced the darkness last night and I had won. I had stared down a man who thought he could erase people and I had made him blink. If I could do that for them, I could do it for us. "Leo," I said as we walked up the porch steps. "Tomorrow we're going to sit down and go through our own paperwork, every bit of it. We're going to find a way." "I know, Mom," he said, opening the door for me. "I'll help." The house was cold, the heater having struggled to keep up while we were gone, but as I stepped inside, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a place where things happened, a place where people were seen. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The whistle of the steam began to fill the room, a bright, cheerful sound that seemed to chase away the last of the shadows. I looked out the window, across the street toward the park where I'd found them. The snow was still there, the wind was still cold, but the world felt different. I realized then that the speechless move wasn't just about bringing them in or fighting the bank. It was about the moment I decided that my own struggle didn't exempt me from caring about theirs. It was the moment I realized that we are all just one storm away from needing a stranger's hand. I poured 2 mugs of tea, the bergamot and honey filling the air. Leo sat down across from me, and for the first time in a long time we talked. Not about what we'd lost or what we were afraid of, but about what we were going to do. We talked about the future as if it were something we had a right to, a territory we were going to reclaim inch by inch. And somewhere across the street, in a small house with a new lock and an old oak tree, 2 people were sitting in the warmth, knowing that they weren't invisible. That was enough. For today, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, a sharp departure from the stagnant grief that had defined my life for so long. Helping Arthur and Martha became a catalyst for my own survival. I found a legal aid clinic 3 towns over, and Leo and I took turns driving them to appointments. We sat in wood-paneled waiting rooms, clutching plastic folders of documents, becoming the kids they needed. The story of the widow and the elderly couple began to ripple through our small community. It started with a neighbor who saw the sheriff's car that morning, then a clerk at the grocery store who heard Martha talking about the angel who'd saved them. People I hadn't spoken to in years began to drop by. They didn't come with pity, they came with questions. They wanted to know how they could help. A local contractor offered to fix Arthur's leaking roof for the cost of materials. A retired bookkeeper spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table, helping me restructure my own debt and finding a clerical error in my mortgage that saved me $200 a month. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a shifting of the tide. One Saturday, about a month after the storm, I was out in the front yard, trying to chip away at the stubborn ice on the sidewalk. The air was crisp, but the sun had a hint of spring in it. I heard a car pull up and looked up to see a familiar beat-up sedan. Arthur and Martha stepped out, looking stronger than I'd ever seen them. Arthur was wearing his own coat now, and Martha had a colorful scarf wrapped around her neck. "Sarah," Arthur called out, his voice steady. I leaned on my shovel, wiping my forehead. "What are you 2 doing out? The news said there's more snow coming tonight." "We couldn't wait," Martha said, walking toward me with a small, wrapped bundle in her arms. "The lawyer called this morning. The bank settled. They admitted the lockout was premature and they've restructured the loan. We're staying, Sarah, for good." I felt a lump form in my throat, a sudden, overwhelming rush of relief. I dropped the shovel and pulled her into a hug. She smelled like lavender and old books, a scent that now meant victory to me. "That's wonderful," I whispered. "That's the best news I've heard in years." Arthur stepped up, his eyes twinkling. "We wanted to bring you something. It's not much, but Martha's been working on it since the day we got back inside." Martha handed me the bundle. I unwrapped the tissue paper to find a hand-knitted blanket. It was a chaotic, beautiful mix of colors, blues, greens, purples, and reds, all woven together in a pattern that looked like a stained glass window. "I used all the scraps I had," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought, since you gave us yours when we had nothing, you should have one of your own to keep the cold out." I ran my fingers over the soft yarn, the stitches even and strong. It was more than a blanket, it was a map of a journey we'd taken together. It was a reminder that even when you're down to scraps, you can still make something beautiful. Thank you, I said, unable to keep the tears from falling. I'll cherish it. As they drove away, waving until they turned the corner, I stood on my sidewalk and looked at my house. It was still small, still in need of paint, and my bank account was still a source of stress. But the silence was gone. In its place was a sense of connection, a web of people who had looked at each other and decided to be brave. I went inside and draped the new blanket over the back of the sofa. Leo came out of his room, his eyes lighting up when he saw it. Wow, he said, touching the yarn. That's cool, Mom. It's more than cool, Leo, I said. It's a shield. That night, as the promised snow began to fall, I sat on the sofa wrapped in Martha's blanket. I didn't feel the chill from the window. I didn't feel the weight of the past due notices. I felt the warmth of a life that had been reclaimed, not just for Arthur and Martha, but for me. I realized then that the most powerful thing you can do when the world tries to make you feel small is to reach out and make someone else feel big. My next move hadn't just left everyone speechless, it had given me my voice back. The winter wasn't over. There would be more storms, more bills, and more days when the grief would try to claw its way back in. But I knew now that I wasn't fighting alone. I had a community. I had a son who saw the world through new eyes, and I had a colorful scrap yarn blanket that reminded me that no one is ever truly invisible unless we choose not to see them. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft sound of the snow against the glass, and for the first time in 3 years I fell asleep without fear. The weeks turned into months, and the harsh white of winter slowly gave way to the muddy, hopeful green of spring. The story of what happened that night on the ice-covered street didn't fade. Instead, it grew, taking on a life of its own. It became a piece of local lore, a reminder to the town that the people living on the margins weren't just statistics. They were neighbors. One afternoon in late April, I was sitting on my porch, watching the tulips I'd planted with Leo start to poke their heads through the soil. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming trees. A car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway, and a woman I'd never met stepped out. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped in a way I recognized all too well. "Are you Sarah?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I am," I said, standing up. "My name is Alina," she said, twisting her car keys in her hands. "I live over on the south side. I heard about what you did for the Vances, and I was wondering if you might know who I should talk to about a utility shut-off notice. I've tried the office, but they just keep putting me on hold." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the same shadow I'd carried for years. The fear of being seen, the shame of struggling, the exhaustion of trying to hold up a world that felt like it was made of lead. I didn't hesitate. I stepped off the porch and walked toward her, my hand outstretched. "Come on in, Alina," I said, my voice steady and warm. "I have some tea on the stove, and I have a notebook full of numbers for people who actually listen. We'll figure it out." As she followed me into the house, I caught a glimpse of Arthur and Martha's house across the street. Arthur was out in the yard, kneeling by the base of his oak tree, planting a ring of bright yellow marigolds. He looked up and caught my eye, giving me a slow, solemn nod of his head, a salute from one survivor to another. I smiled back, then turned and led Alina into my kitchen. The house didn't feel small anymore. It didn't feel like a place of loss. It felt like a headquarters. It felt like a lighthouse. And as I poured 2 mugs of tea, I knew that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning, one person, one cup of tea, and one defiant act of kindness at a time. The speechless move hadn't been a single event, it was a way of living. And as I sat down across from Alina, I realized that I had finally found the one thing Elias would have wanted me to have most of all, a reason to keep the light on. The tea was hot, the sun was shining, and for the first time the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a conversation. "So," I said, opening my notebook, "tell me everything, we're going to make a plan." And as we talked, the shadows in the room seemed to retreat, pushed back by the simple, radical act of two people deciding that they weren't going to let the world win. Outside, the oak tree stood tall, its new leaves unfurling in the breeze, a living testament to the fact that even after the deepest freeze, life finds a way to take root again. I looked at Elena, who was taking her first sip of tea, her shoulders finally starting to drop. I knew the road ahead of her was long, but I also knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. None of us would. And that was the most important move of all. As the months stretched into a year, the ripple effect of that one cold night continued to transform not just my life, but the entire neighborhood. What had started as a simple act of sheltering two strangers had evolved into something much larger, a grassroots network of support that we jokingly called the Kitchen Table Council. We didn't have a budget, and we didn't have an office. What we had was my mismatched wooden chairs and a growing list of resources. We helped people navigate the labyrinth of social services. We organized tool libraries where neighbors could share lawnmowers and snowblowers, and we made sure that no one ever had to face a past due notice in total isolation. Leo, who had been a quiet, withdrawn teenager, blossomed into the council's unofficial tech expert. He set up a simple website where people could post needs, need a ride to the doctor, have extra eggs from the chickens, can anyone help with a leaky faucet? And he taught the older members of the neighborhood how to use it. Seeing him engage with the world again, seeing the pride in his eyes when he helped someone like Martha set up a video call with her sister, was a gift I could never have imagined. Arthur and Martha became the heart of our little community. Their house, once a symbol of corporate cruelty, became a hub of activity. Arthur's garden grew until it spilled over the fence, and he spent his afternoons teaching the neighborhood kids how to grow tomatoes and peppers. Martha started a knitting circle, and soon, the stained glass blankets were appearing on porches all over the street, a silent signal that this was a house where you could find a friend. My own financial situation didn't change overnight. I still worked my shifts, I still had to be careful with every dollar, and my car still rattled. But the crushing weight of the anxiety was gone. I had learned that my value wasn't measured by my bank balance, but by the strength of the hands I held. One evening, after a particularly long meeting of the council, I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, streaked with gold and orange. Arthur walked across the street, carrying a small plate of Martha's famous lemon bars. "Quiet night," he said, sitting down in the chair beside me. "The best kind," I agreed, taking a bar. We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the crickets and the distant sound of a lawnmower. It was a peaceful, settled silence, the kind you only get when you fought hard for it. "You know, Sarah," Arthur said, looking out at the street. "That night, the night you pulled over in the storm, I really didn't think there was anyone left in the world who would see us. I thought we were just done." I looked at him, his face etched with the lines of a long and difficult life, but his eyes bright with a renewed sense of purpose. "I thought I was done too, Arthur," I admitted. "I was just going through the motions. I was so afraid of losing what I had left that I forgot I had anything to give." He nodded slowly. "It's a funny thing, isn't it? You save two old people from the cold, and you end up saving a whole town." I laughed softly. I don't know about saving a whole town, but I think we're doing okay. Better than okay, he said, standing up and patting my hand. Much better than okay. As he walked back to his house, the lights in the windows of the neighborhood began to flicker on one by one. Each one felt like a promise kept. I leaned back in my chair, wrapping Martha's scrap yarn blanket around my shoulders. The air was cooling down, but I didn't feel the chill. I felt the warmth of 1,000 small connections, a tapestry of lives woven together by the simple decision to pull over and help. I looked up at the stars, thinking of Elias. I hoped he could see us. I hoped he could see the house he'd built and the son he'd raised and the woman I'd become. I thought he'd be proud. Not because I'd done something heroic, but because I'd done something human. The speechless move wasn't a miracle. It was just a choice. And in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, a single choice can be the most powerful thing there is. I stood up, took the empty plate inside, and locked the door. Not because I was afraid of what was outside, but because I knew exactly what was inside. A home, a family, a future. And as I turned off the light, I knew that whatever tomorrow brought, whatever storms, whatever challenges, whatever surprises, we would face them together. Because in this house, on this street, no one was invisible. And that was the greatest victory of all. As the years passed, the story of the widow and the elderly couple became more than just a memory. It became the foundation of a new way of being. The Kitchen Table Council grew into a formalized nonprofit, but we kept the name. We moved out of my kitchen and into a small storefront downtown, donated by a local business owner who had seen the impact of our work. I eventually retired from my job, but I didn't stop working. I became the director of the council, spending my days coordinating volunteers and advocating for those who had been forgotten by the system. Leo went to college and became a social worker, his career choice a direct result of the night he'd watched his mother bring two strangers in from the cold. He often called me to talk about his cases, and I could hear the same fierce empathy in his voice that I'd seen in him when he was 17. Arthur and Martha lived out their days in their little cottage on Maple Street. They passed away within months of each other, peacefully, in the home they had fought so hard to keep. Their children, who had been estranged for years, came back for the funeral. They were moved by the stories the neighbors told them, stories of a man who taught children to garden and a woman who knitted blankets for everyone she met. They decided to keep the house in the family, turning it into a community garden and a space for the council's youth programs. On the day of the dedication for the Vance Community Garden, I stood on the porch where I'd first seen them, looking out at the crowd. There were people from all walks of life, business owners, retirees, young families, and those who were still struggling to find their footing. They were all there because of a single, desperate moment in a winter storm. I was an older woman now, my hair silver and my movements a bit slower, but the fire that had been lit that night still burned brightly. I looked at the past due notices I'd kept in a frame in my office, a reminder of where I'd been and why I did what I did. I stepped up to the microphone, the sun warm on my face. I didn't have a prepared speech. I just looked at the faces in the crowd and thought about the woman I'd been, the widow who was one pothole away from disaster. People often ask me why I did it, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon. Why I pulled over when I was already struggling myself. And the truth is, I didn't do it because I was a hero. I did it because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I didn't see them, no one would ever see me. I paused, looking at the oak tree, which was now massive, its branches reaching out like protective arms over the garden. But what I learned that night is that when you see someone else, you finally see yourself. You see that you have power even when you have nothing. You see, that kindness isn't something you do when you're comfortable, it's something you do to survive. I looked at Leo, who was standing in the front row with his own young daughter. She was clutching a small, scrap yarn blanket that Martha had made for her before she passed. We are all just one storm away from needing each other, I concluded. And as long as we remember that, the cold will never truly win. The applause that followed was soft, like the sound of rain on leaves. It wasn't a celebration of a grand gesture, it was an acknowledgement of a shared truth. As the sun began to set, I walked through the garden, touching the petals of the marigolds and the rough bark of the oak tree. I felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling that my life had come full circle. I had lost much, but I had gained a world. I walked back to my own house, the one across the street that had once felt so empty. It was full now, full of memories, full of purpose, and full of the quiet, steady light of a life well lived. I sat on my porch, wrapped in my own stained glass blanket, and watched the stars come out. I wasn't speechless anymore. I had a story to tell, a town to care for, and a heart that was finally truly warm. And as the night air cooled, I leaned back and smiled, knowing that somewhere out there another storm was brewing, and that somewhere else another person was getting ready to pull over and change everything. The stars above Maple Street are the same ones that looked down on us that first night, though they seem brighter now, or perhaps it's just that I'm no longer squinting through the tears of my own desperation. Sitting here, the wood of the porch chair groaning softly under my weight, I realize that the silence of a successful life is much different from the silence of a lonely one. It's heavier, more resonant, like a bell that has finally stopped ringing but still vibrates with the memory of the sound. I look across the street at the Vance Community Garden, where the shadows of the trellis crawl across the silvered grass, and my mind drifts back to the period I usually gloss over when I tell the story to the newspapers. The 3 years of grinding, agonizing uncertainty that followed that first winter. It wasn't all soup and blankets. It was a war of attrition fought in wood-paneled courtrooms and over cold cups of coffee in the back of the local library. I remember the day Marcus, their son, finally showed his face after the initial shock had worn off. He didn't come to apologize. He came because he heard a meddling widow was trying to challenge the deed he'd coerced his parents into signing. He pulled up to my curb in a car that cost more than my house, the engine a low, arrogant purr that seemed to mock the peeling paint on my shutters. When I opened the door, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had simply decided that his own comfort was the only currency that mattered. He had his father's jawline, but none of the kindness behind it. I stood on that threshold, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I realized then that kindness wasn't just an emotion, it was a shield. I didn't let him in. I stood there in my worn cardigan, smelling of the onions I'd been chopping for dinner, and I told him that if he wanted to speak to his parents, he could do it through the legal counsel we had secured through the council's first pro bono volunteer. The legal battle that followed was a slow, jagged thing. Arthur would sit at my kitchen table, his large, calloused hands trembling as he tried to read through the depositions. He couldn't understand how the boy he'd taught to fish, the child he'd stayed up with through bouts of croup and broken bones, could look at him and see nothing but an obstacle to a real estate commission. Martha was different. She went quiet, a deep, hollow silence that worried me more than Arthur's tears. She spent those months knitting with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. The click-clack of her needles became the heartbeat of our house, a rhythmic defense against the cruelty of the world outside. She wasn't just making blankets, she was weaving a net to catch them both before they hit the bottom. I remember one night in particular, halfway through the second year. The heat had broken and a late summer thunderstorm was rolling in, the air thick with the scent of ozone and wet dust. We were sitting in the living room, the lights flickering as the wind whipped the oak tree against the roof. Leo was upstairs studying, the soft glow of his desk lamp, a beacon of the future we were trying to protect. Arthur looked up from a stack of legal papers and said, "Sarah, why are you doing this? We're just two old people. You could have had your peace back a long time ago." I looked at him, really looked at him. The way his eyes were clouded with age but still held a spark of the man who had built a life from nothing, and I thought about my own husband. I thought about the empty space on his side of the bed, and the way the past due notices used to make me feel like I was drowning in a shallow pool. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. His skin felt like parchment, thin and fragile, but the heat beneath it was undeniable. "Because, Arthur," I said, my voice steady despite the thunder shaking the floorboards, "I spent a long time thinking I was invisible. I thought that if I went under, the water wouldn't even ripple. But when I saw you two at that bus station, I realized that if I let you disappear, I'd be admitting that I don't exist either. We're holding each other up. That's the only way anyone stays standing." He didn't say anything for a long time. He just squeezed my hand, a grip that was surprisingly strong, and for the first time since that snowy night, I saw the shame leave his eyes, replaced by a quiet, iron-willed dignity. We won the house back 6 months later, not because of some grand legal loophole, but because the community had begun to stir. The local paper had run a story about the Vance betrayal, and suddenly Marcus found that his business connections were drying up. People didn't want to buy houses from a man who had evicted his own parents. The pressure of 1,000 small judgments, the cold shoulders at the grocery store, the silent phone lines eventually broke him. He signed the house back over in a fit of pique, a final act of cowardice disguised as a settlement, and moved 2 states away. When Arthur and Martha finally moved back into their cottage, I walked them across the street. The house was dusty and smelled of neglect, but as Martha touched the floral wallpaper in the hallway, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She didn't cry. She just went to the kitchen, filled a kettle, and put it on the stove. It was the most defiant act I had ever witnessed. Now, as I sit here on my porch, an old woman watching the moonlight dance on the marigolds, I think about the weight of those years. The council grew from that struggle, born not out of a desire for charity, but out of a demand for justice. We learned that the system isn't some faceless machine, it's a collection of choices made by neighbors. I look at my hands, spotted with age and slightly gnarled at the knuckle, and I don't see weakness. I see the tools that helped rebuild a family. I hear the front door of the cottage across the street open. A young man steps out, a volunteer for the youth program, probably finishing up some late-night prep for the garden's spring planting. He sees me sitting there and raises a hand in a silent wave. I wave back, a slow, deliberate movement. He doesn't know the full story. He only knows the legend of the widow of Maple Street and the garden that grew from a storm. He doesn't know about the nights I sat in the dark, counting pennies and wondering if I'd made a mistake. He doesn't know about the hot, righteous anger that still flares in my chest when I think of Marcus's expensive car. But he knows that this street is safe. He knows that if he falls, someone will see him. The night air is getting colder now, a precursor to the autumn chill that always reminds me of my joints, but I don't go inside yet. I want to savor this. the feeling of a town that breathes together. I think about Leo, now a man with his own burdens and his own triumphs, and I realize that the greatest gift I gave him wasn't an education or a house. It was the knowledge that the world is only as cold as we allow it to be. I close my eyes for a moment, listening to the rustle of the oak leaves. They sound like Martha's knitting needles. Click, clack, building something, protecting something. I am a woman who was once speechless, silenced by grief and the terror of poverty. But tonight, the silence is a choice. It is the quiet of a heart that has said everything it needed to say, not in words, but in the steady, unwavering act of staying. I stand up slowly, my knees popping in the quiet, and I wrap my stained glass blanket tighter around my shoulders. The colors are faded now, the wool thinning in places, but it still holds the heat. I take one last look at the Vance Community Garden at the spot where the marigolds will bloom brightest come July, and I turn toward my front door. Inside, the house is warm. The lights are low. And for the first time in a very long time, I don't feel the need to look over my shoulder at the storm. I am home, and because of that one night, so are they. The door clicks shut behind me, a sound as final and comforting as the end of a long prayer. Inside, the air carries the faint, lingering scent of cinnamon and old paper, the smell of a life that has been lived in, rather than just passed through. I move toward the hallway, my gait a little stiffer than it was 30 years ago, my shadow stretching long and thin against the floral wallpaper that Martha helped me pick out during the first summer they were back in their home. I remember how her fingers, no longer trembling with the cold but with the excitement of choice, had traced the delicate vines on the sample book. She had chosen a pattern of climbing jasmine, saying it reminded her of the garden she thought she'd lost forever. I stop at the small mahogany side table where the photographs are clustered, a silver-framed congregation of the faces that define my world. There is Leo on his graduation day, his shoulders broad, wearing a smile that carries none of the shadows of our leanest years. Beside him is Mia, my firebrand, my daughter who took the righteous anger she saw in this house and turned it into a career in public advocacy. In the photo, she's standing in front of a courthouse, her chin tilted at that same stubborn angle I used to see when she'd insist on sharing her last apple with Arthur. They are grown now, with lives and homes of their own, but I see the echoes of that snowy night in the way they move through the world. They don't look away when they see someone stumbling. They know because they saw it happen in their own living room that a person's dignity is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a bank's ledger or a son's greed, but easily mended by a bowl of soup and a warm blanket. I pick up a smaller, tarnished frame tucked toward the back. It's a candid shot of Arthur and Martha sitting on their porch, a few years before Arthur passed away. He's holding a seed packet, squinting at the fine print, while Martha leans over his shoulder, laughing. That was the year we broke ground on the first community plot. We hadn't intended for it to become a movement. We just wanted to make sure that no one else on Maple Street would ever have to choose between heating their home and filling their stomach. We started by planting potatoes and kale in the strip of land between our houses, a defiant reclamation of the earth. The council, as the neighbors began to call us, didn't have a boardroom or a charter. We had my kitchen table and a rotating pot of coffee. We were a group of widows, single mothers, and retirees, the people the world often considers surplus. But we found that when you pool your surplus of time or your surplus of empathy, you become an unstoppable force. We began showing up at zoning meetings and city hall, not with placards but with stories. We made the councilmen look at our faces, the faces of their own mothers and grandmothers, and we asked them why the city was more interested in building luxury condos than in protecting its elders. We were a nuisance, a persistent, polite, and unyielding itch in the side of the local government. And we won. My fingers brushed the glass over Martha's face. She followed Arthur only 6 months after he died, slipping away in her sleep as if she simply couldn't bear to keep him waiting on the other side. They left the cottage to the council, a final gift that ensured the garden would never be sold to a developer. Today, that cottage serves as a respite center, a place where people in crisis can find a bed and a meal while they figure out their next step. It's a living monument to the fact that one woman's yes can ripple out through the decades. I set the photo back down and moved to the kitchen. My joints ache, a dull thrumming that reminds me of the passage of time, but I find I don't mind the pain. It's a physical record of the miles I've walked and the weight I've carried. I fill a glass with water and catch my reflection in the window over the sink. The woman looking back at me has white hair and skin like a map of 1,000 journeys, but her eyes are the same ones that looked out into the snow all those years ago. They are the eyes of someone who saw a wrong and for once didn't wait for someone else to fix it. I think about Marcus sometimes, though less often as the years go by. I wonder if he ever regrets the choice he made, or if he spent his life building higher walls to keep out the guilt. I don't hate him anymore. Hate takes too much energy, and I need mine for the marigolds. I realized a long time ago that Marcus wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had forgotten that we are all, at some point, made of bird bones and grief. He thought power came from what you could take, while Arthur and Martha taught me that true power comes from what you are willing to share. I turn off the kitchen light and make my way toward the bedroom. The house is silent, but it isn't a lonely silence. It's the quiet of a garden in winter, resting, gathering strength beneath the frost. I know that tomorrow morning the sun will hit the frost on the garden gate, and the volunteers will arrive with their gloves and their shovels. They will tell stories of the widow of Maple Street, and I will probably come out and tell them they're exaggerating, that I was just a mother who was tired of the cold. But as I pull the covers up and feel the weight of the stained glass blanket, mended now in a dozen places, a patchwork of my own history, I know the truth. I didn't just save Arthur and Martha that night. I saved myself. I saved the woman I was becoming, the one who might have hardened her heart to survive. Instead, I let it break open, and in that breaking, I found enough room to house a whole neighborhood. The storm eventually ended, as all storms do, but the warmth we created together, that is something the winter can never touch. I close my eyes, listening to the house breathe, and finally I sleep. But sleep is never truly silent. It is a doorway back to the heat of the beginning, a place where the shadows of the past are more vivid than the sunlight of the present. The dream always starts with the sound of the heavy oak door thudding shut against the wind, a sound that signaled the end of the storm's reign over our lives and the beginning of what the neighbors would later call the council. In the memory that occupies the very marrow of my bones, the transition from the freezing, indifferent dark of the street to the amber glow of my hallway was so violent it made my teeth ache. I can still see Leo and Mia standing there, framed by the kitchen archway, their faces shifting from the quiet boredom of a Tuesday night to a profound, wide-eyed shock as I ushered in two soaking wet strangers. They were so young then, their limbs still reaching for the height they would eventually claim, their faces smooth and unlined by the world's weight. Leo's eyes went wide, drifting from my salt-streaked face down to Arthur's trembling hand gripped tightly in mine, then to Martha, who looked like a small, sodden bird caught in a downpour. Mia stood frozen, a wooden spoon in her hand, the steam from the stove curling behind her like a ghost of the dinner we were supposed to be eating alone. For a heartbeat, we were a tableau of shock, a frozen frame of the exact moment our lives tilted on their axis. I didn't give them time to question the logic or the safety of bringing two strangers into our sanctuary. I moved into a version of myself I hadn't fully inhabited since the weeks following my husband's funeral. A woman of iron and movement, stripped of hesitation. A woman who knew that in a crisis, the only sin is stillness. Leo blankets. The thickest ones from the cedar chest, and get the space heater from the garage, I commanded, my voice raspy from the biting cold and the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Mia, the soup, don't wait for it to simmer to perfection, just get it hot. We need bowls, the big ceramic ones. Now, children, move. They didn't falter. They had been raised in the long, quiet shadow of a great loss, taught by the very absence of their father that kindness isn't a luxury you afford when you have extra. It's a necessity you provide because you know what it's like to have nothing. Leo was up the stairs before I'd even finished the sentence, his footsteps a frantic, rhythmic thumping on the old wood. Mia turned back to the stove, her movements suddenly efficient and focused, her young shoulders squaring as she took on the role of nourisher. I led Arthur and Martha toward the living room, my hands steadying their elbows, feeling the way their bones seemed to rattle within their frames. Their movements were brittle and precarious, as if they were made of glass that had been left out in the frost too long. The air in the house began to transform almost instantly. The sharp, metallic scent of damp wool and old rain began to clash with the rising, savory aroma of sautéed onions, carrots, and thyme. It was the smell of a rescue in progress. As I eased Martha into the velvet recliner, her wet coat heavy and smelling of the bus stop's despair, I saw her look around the room. She wasn't looking at the furniture or the modest photos on the mantel. She was looking at the warmth itself, watching the way the lamplight hit the dust motes, as if she couldn't believe it was a physical substance she was finally allowed to touch again. Arthur sat on the edge of the sofa, his head bowed low, his gnarled hands tucked between his knees to stop the violent shaking that seemed to come from deep within his chest. When Leo returned, draped in the heavy, moth-balled weight of the family blankets, he didn't ask questions. He didn't look at me for approval or an explanation of why we were helping people his own brother had discarded. He simply knelt at Arthur's feet, wrapping the old man's legs with the same instinctive tenderness he used when he was a small boy. It was a silent passing of the torch, a realization that the walls of our home weren't meant to keep the world out, but to act as a vessel to keep the light in. I began the intimate, quiet work of peeling away their wet layers. The sodden fabric clung to their skin like a second, colder grief, and as I helped Martha out of her cardigan, I felt the fragility of her shoulders. Every button I undid felt like a small, defiant victory against Marcus's cruelty and the world's indifference. Every shiver that subsided as the blankets took hold felt like a prayer finally being answered in the affirmative. We were no longer just a family of three mourning a ghost in a house that felt too quiet. We were a crew of 5 on a small, sturdy ship, navigating the tail end of a hurricane. For the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel empty. It felt exactly the right size for the burden we were now privileged to carry. Martha's hands were the first thing I watched as the heat began to do its slow, miraculous work. They were map-like, a lattice of blue veins and translucent skin that gradually flushed from a deathly bruised purple to a delicate living pink. She cradled the ceramic bowl Mia had brought her as if it were a holy relic, the steam rising to dampen her eyelashes and soften the hard lines of exhaustion etched into her face. "I had peace roses," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves in a late autumn wind, "right by the front porch." They were a temperamental sort, always needing a bit of bone meal and a lot of patience, but when they bloomed, the whole street smelled like heaven. She paused, a small, sad smile ghosting across her lips as she looked into the depths of her soup, her eyes unfocused as if she were seeing through the walls of my living room and back to a life that had been snatched away. "I wonder if they'll remember to water them, or if they'll just let the weeds take the yard now that we're gone." Marcus always hated gardening. Said it was beneath him to get his fingernails dirty. The mention of her yard brought a sharp, sudden clarity to the room. It wasn't just a house they had lost. It was a living history, a physical manifestation of 50 years of breathing and dreaming. She spoke of the kitchen door frame, the one tucked behind the pantry door where the wood was soft and scarred by decades of lead pencil marks. "The grandchildren," she said, her eyes drifting toward Leo, who was sitting cross-legged on the rug, his expression uncharacteristically grave. "We'd stand them up straight, heels against the molding, and mark how much they'd grown since the last summer. Every notch was a victory. I can still see the little M for Marcus at the very bottom, from when he was just a toddler with skinned knees and a laugh that could brighten a cellar. I used to think those marks were permanent. I thought they were part of the house's bones." At the mention of his son's name, Arthur's shoulders hitched, a sharp, involuntary movement that spoke of a deep-seated agony. He didn't look up, but his grip on the heavy wool blanket tightened until his knuckles went white. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a low, guttural rumble, vibrating with the ghost of the man he used to be. The man who had provided, who had protected, and who had been discarded like an obsolete tool. "The shipyard was a loud place," he said, staring at the flickering shadows on the rug. "Steel on steel, the smell of hot grease and salt air. I worked 30 years in that noise to buy that patch of dirt. I thought I was building a foundation that would outlast me. I used to come home with my boots caked in grime, and Marcus would run out to meet me before I even hit the porch. We'd play catch until the sun went down and the fireflies came out. I taught him how to throw a curveball in that yard. I taught him that a man's word is his bond and his family is his lifeblood." He let out a ragged breath that sounded like a sob caught in a throat full of gravel. "I don't know where that boy went. I don't know who that man in the suit is. The one who looked at us through the window of his car like we were nothing more than a debt he was finally done paying. Like we were a mistake he was correcting." Leo and Mia sat on the floor, their own soup forgotten for the moment, their eyes fixed on these two elders as if they were seeing the future and the past colliding in real time. The flickering light of the single lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the wallpaper, making the room feel smaller, more intimate, like a sanctuary in the middle of a storm. My children were silent, but I could see the gears turning behind their somber expressions. They weren't just hearing a story about a cruel man and his abandoned parents. They were witnessing the fragility of a life's work. They were seeing how easily the things we build, the gardens, the traditions, the memories marked in pencil, can be dismantled by a heart that has grown cold and a mind that has forgotten the weight of a father's hand or a mother's prayer. This was the lesson I had struggled to articulate in the years since their father died. That love is not a passive feeling, but a choice you make every single morning, and that the only true compass we have in this world is the one that points toward the suffering of others. We sat there in the hallowed quiet, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional comforting pop of the radiator, a family of three and a couple of strangers bound together by the sudden, terrifying realization that we are all only one closed door away from the dark. I looked at my children and knew that they were no longer just watching a tragedy. They were participating in an act of resistance. Every spoonful of soup they offered, every blanket they tucked, was a strike against the coldness Marcus had unleashed. We were holding the line, right here in our small, warm kitchen, refusing to let the shadows win. The sun rose the next morning not with a bang, but with a soft, persistent gray light that filtered through the frost-patterned windows, illuminating the new, strange choreography of our lives. The transition from a house of three to a house of five happened with a quiet, stumbling grace. It was in the way Arthur's heavy work boots sat neatly beside Leo's scuffed sneakers in the mudroom, a silent pact of shared space. By the second afternoon, the kitchen table had become a bridge between generations. Arthur, wearing a pair of reading glasses held together at the temple by a sliver of electrical tape, hovered over Leo's geometry homework. I watched from the stove, my heart catching as I saw Arthur's thick, calloused finger, a finger that had spent decades guiding rivets into steel, trace the delicate lines of a hypotenuse. He wasn't just teaching Leo how to find an angle. He was showing him the shortcuts of an engineer, the practical magic of a man who understood that the world was built on precision and balance. "You see, son," Arthur's voice was a low hum, steadier than it had been the night before. "If the foundation isn't square, the whole house will eventually lean into the wind. Geometry isn't just on the paper, it's in the bones of everything that stays standing." Leo, usually so restless and quick to frustration, sat perfectly still, absorbing the wisdom of a man who had built things meant to last. In the living room, the rhythmic click-clack of knitting needles and the soft pull of thread became the new soundtrack to our afternoons. Martha had taken over the corner of the sofa, her silver thimble catching the light like a tiny, defiant shield. She had Mia's favorite school sweater, the one with the frayed hem I'd been meaning to fix for months, spread across her lap. Mia sat tucked beside her, her small hands mimicking Martha's practiced movements. Martha's voice was a gentle murmur, weaving stories of her own grandmother into the instructions on how to catch a dropped stitch. "We don't throw things away just because they're a little torn, Mia," she said, her eyes bright despite the fatigue etched into the skin around them. "We mend them, we make them stronger at the break." I stood in the doorway for a moment, a dish towel forgotten in my hand, struck by how the house felt physically heavier, yet somehow more buoyant. The silence that had haunted the hallways since Elia's past was gone, replaced by the friction of lives rubbing against one another, generating a warmth that no radiator could provide. But that warmth was a fragile thing, bought with the currency of my own exhaustion. To keep the pantry stocked and the oil tank filled for 5 instead of 3, I began taking every double shift offered at the diner. My world became a blur of cracked linoleum, the smell of burnt coffee, and the constant, dull ache in my lower back. I moved through the lunch rushes like a ghost in an apron, my mind always half turned toward the stack of papers waiting for me at home. When I finally returned in the late hours, the house would be hushed, the children and the elders tucked into their respective dreams, but I couldn't sleep. I would sit at the kitchen table under the harsh glow of the overhead light, surrounded by the legal documents I had managed to pry from the county records office. The paperwork was a cold, clinical map of a betrayal, so profound it made my blood run thin. I pored over the quitclaim deed, the ink of Marcus's signature looking sharp and predatory against the faded parchment of his parents' original title. The dates told a story of calculated cruelty. He had waited until Arthur was recovering from a bout of pneumonia, until their defenses were lowered by age and illness, to slide the papers across the table under the guise of estate planning. He hadn't just taken their house. He had committed a slow-motion robbery of their dignity, using legal jargon to camouflage the fact that he was rendering his own flesh and blood homeless. I traced the notary's stamp, wondering how much a soul costs these days, and realized that Marcus hadn't just broken a law, he had severed the very cord that holds a society together. The deeper I dug into the fraudulent transfer, the more I realized that the man in the suit, the son who had looked at them like a debt to be settled, had left a paper trail of his own arrogance. He thought no one would look. He thought they were too old to fight and I was too poor to care. He was wrong on both counts. As the clock chimed 3 in the morning, I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt a cold, sharpening resolve. We weren't just sharing soup and blankets, we were preparing for a reckoning. The engine of my old sedan groaned as I turned the key, a sputtering protest against the biting December air, but I didn't care if the muffler fell off right there in the driveway. I had the quitclaim deed tucked into my purse, a heavy, cursed thing, and a phone with a full battery. I drove away from my quiet, salt-crusted street, leaving the warmth of Arthur and Martha behind, and headed toward the hills where the air seemed to get thinner and the houses grew exponentially larger. The transition was jarring. My neighborhood was a place of peeling paint and communal struggle, but as I crossed the invisible line into the heights, the world transformed into a curated winter wonderland. Every lawn was a stage, draped in thousands of blue and white LED lights that didn't twinkle so much as they glared. They were garish, expensive displays of excess that felt like a mockery of the shivering couple I'd found on that bench. These lights didn't offer warmth. They offered a warning that this was a place for winners, and the Millers had been discarded like last year's tinsel. I pulled up to a sprawling colonial that looked more like a boutique hotel than a home. A wreath the size of a tractor tire hung on the mahogany front door, illuminated by spotlights that made the snow look like crushed diamonds. My heart was already hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird seeking an exit, but I forced my hands to stay steady. I reached into my pocket and swiped the screen of my phone, hitting the record button on the voice memo app. I took a breath of the frigid air, the kind that stings the back of your throat, and walked up the heated stone path. When I pressed the bell, the chime that echoed inside was deep and melodic, a sound that cost more than my monthly mortgage. A few moments later, the door swung open, and I was hit with a wave of warmth that smelled of expensive sandalwood and roasting meat. Marcus Miller stood there, looking exactly like the predator I had imagined from the signatures on those papers. He was polished, wearing a cashmere sweater the color of a stormy sea, his hair perfectly groomed. He looked at my old coat and my tired eyes with a flicker of confusion that quickly sharpened into a dismissive sneer. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth, the kind of voice used to giving orders. "I'm the woman who's been harboring your parents for the last 3 days," I said, my voice surprisingly level despite the roar of blood in my ears. "The ones you left in the cold." His eyes narrowed, and for a second a shadow of something not guilt, but annoyance crossed his face. He didn't invite me in. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door slightly behind him as if to protect his pristine life from the contagion of my presence. "Look, if you're looking for a reward or a finder's fee, you're talking to the wrong person," he said, his tone dripping with a casual, terrifying coldness. "Arthur and Martha are difficult. They've reached a point where they are nothing but burdens. Incontinent liabilities, really. We tried to find a facility, but they were stubborn. If they chose to sit on a bench, that was their prerogative." The word liabilities hit me like a physical blow. I thought of Arthur's calloused fingers guiding Leo's hand over a geometry book. I thought of Martha mending Mia's sweater, her silver thimble a shield against the world's indifference. "They weren't stubborn, Marcus. You tricked them. You had them sign over their home when they were at their weakest. I've seen the papers." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't trick anyone. I streamlined a transition. They couldn't maintain that property, and I wasn't about to let the equity rot while they fumbled through their final years. It's called estate management. If you've taken them in, that's on you. You want to play the Good Samaritan? Enjoy the laundry and the medical bills. Just don't bring your hand out to me." I gripped the phone in my pocket, making sure I didn't move it, documenting every syllable of his arrogance. The contrast between this man, this well-fed, well-clothed shell of a human, and the two beautiful souls currently sleeping in my spare room fueled a fire in me I hadn't felt since before Elias died. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a righteous, scorching rage. He thought he had won because he had the law on his side and money in his pocket. He thought he was untouchable behind his wall of expensive lights. But as I looked at him, I realized he was the one who was truly impoverished. He had traded his parents' dignity for a heated driveway, and he was too small a man to even realize the debt he'd incurred. I turned away without another word, the recording still running, knowing that the liabilities he spoke of were the only things in this world that actually mattered. The reckoning wasn't just coming, I was carrying it home with me in my pocket. The drive home was a blur of salt-stained asphalt and the rhythmic, hypnotic sweep of my windshield wipers. My hands were still shaking, a fine electric tremor that seemed to vibrate right down to my marrow. Every time I inhaled, I could still smell that expensive sandalwood from Marcus's foyer, a scent that now turned my stomach. I reached over and patted the passenger seat where my phone lay, the screen dark but holding that digital poison, the evidence of a son's betrayal. I felt like I was carrying a live grenade, something heavy and dangerous that could blow a hole right through the polished facade of the Miller name. When I pulled into my gravel driveway, the sight of my small, sagging porch brought a lump to my throat. It wasn't a mansion, and the siding needed power washing, but the light spilling from the living room window was gold and honest. Inside, I found Arthur and Martha sitting on the sofa, their shoulders touching. They were looking at an old photo album Mia had dragged out from the hallway closet. The sight of them, so fragile, so unaware of the venom their son had just spat into the night air, made my chest ache with a physical, bruising pressure. I didn't tell them where I'd been. I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I went into the kitchen and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. David Vance answered on the fourth ring. His voice was like a well-worn leather chair, deep, gravelly, and instantly comforting. He had been Elias' closest friend and mentor, a man who had spent 40 years navigating the labyrinth of probate and elder law. I told him everything, my voice low and urgent as I paced the linoleum floor. I told him about the park bench, the signatures on the deed, and finally I played a snippet of the recording. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm. He called them incontinent liabilities, David, I whispered, my eyes stinging. He's handed us the rope to hang him with, Sarah, David replied, his tone chillingly professional. But we have to be careful. A man like Marcus Miller has friends in high places. We don't just need the law, we need the court of public opinion. We need to make it impossible for him to hide behind his lawyers. Over the next week, we moved in secret. David began drafting the filings for undue influence and elder financial abuse, while I took on a different kind of preparation. I went to the thrift shop and then to the high-end department store in the city, dipping into the small emergency fund Elias had left me. It was money meant for a new roof or a transmission, but as I ran my fingers over a charcoal wool suit for Arthur and a deep sapphire blue silk dress for Martha, I knew this was the real emergency. I brought the packages home and laid them out on their bed. Martha's breath hitched when she saw the silk. She touched the hem with a trembling finger, her eyes wide. Sarah, we can't. This is too much. You are going to a party, I said, my voice firm as I tucked a stray lock of her silver hair behind her ear. A celebration of the season, and you are going to look like the royalty you are. I spent the following days organizing the community winter social. I called every neighbor, every local business owner, and several members of the press I knew from my days working at the local Gazette. I framed it as a tribute to the town's history, a way to honor our elders. I knew Marcus would come. He was a man who couldn't resist a microphone or a chance to look like a pillar of the community. He would come to preen, unaware that the stage I was building was actually a gallows. Every time I looked at Arthur in his new suit, standing a little taller, his eyes regaining a flicker of the man he used to be, the terror in my gut was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I was a widow with a mortgage and 2 children, but I was also a mother who had just expanded her flock, and God help anyone who tried to take them from me. The hall was a drafty old structure, a relic of the town's industrial heyday that usually smelled of floor wax and the wet wool of coats piled high on the side tables. Tonight, however, it felt different. The air was charged, vibrating with a tension that I could feel in the very marrow of my bones. I watched Martha as she smoothed the sapphire blue silk over her hips, her hands shaking with a fine, rhythmic tremor. She looked like a different woman, not the ghost I had found shivering on a park bench, but a matriarch reclaimed from the shadows of her own life. Arthur stood beside her, his charcoal suit fitting him better than I'd hoped. His tie was slightly crooked, a small human imperfection that made my throat tighten, but his chin was set in a way I hadn't seen before. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by a flickering, uncertain spark of hope. I reached out and straightened his lapel, my own fingers ice cold despite the heat pumping through the old iron radiators. Remember, I whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap I'd bought them. You aren't guests here tonight. You are the foundation of this town. You belong in this room more than anyone else. We walked into the main room, and the wall of sound hit us like a physical force. The local high school quartet was tucked into a corner, playing a medley of winter classics that sounded tinny against the high, vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of spiced cider and the expectant hum of 100 conversations. It was the sound of a community preening itself, everyone dressed in their Sunday best, eager to be seen doing something good. I saw Marcus almost immediately. He was the sun around which a small, sycophantic solar system revolved. Standing near the refreshment table, he was surrounded by local business owners and a couple of city council members I recognized from the front page of the Gazette. He was holding a plastic cup of punch with the poise of a man holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He looked polished, radiant with the kind of confidence only a man who has successfully buried his conscience can wear. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car, the fabric shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights. When his eyes landed on us, I saw the flicker of annoyance cross his face, a brief, dark cloud over his practiced, charitable smile. He didn't see the trap. He didn't see the woman who had spent the last 48 hours huddled over a kitchen table with a lawyer drinking cold coffee and mapping out a battlefield. He only saw his inconvenient parents, dressed up for what he likely assumed was a final public appearance before he tucked them away into the sterile obscurity of a managed care facility. He actually had the audacity to nod at me, a patronizing gesture that said, "Good job, little widow, you kept them presentable." I left Arthur and Martha with a group of their old neighbors, people who had genuinely missed them, people who had been fed a steady diet of lies about the Millers being unwell or traveling. The look of shock on the neighbors' faces as they realized Arthur was perfectly lucid was the first crack in the dam. I didn't stay to watch the water seep through. I made my way to the podium at the front of the room. The microphone gave a sharp, metallic screech as I adjusted it, a sound that sliced through the chatter and brought the room to a sudden, expectant halt. I could feel Marcus's gaze on me now, curious and perhaps a little smug. He likely expected a speech about the spirit of giving, a public thank you for his family's long-standing presence in the community. "Thank you all for coming," I began. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steadier than I felt, echoing off the wooden rafters. I gripped the edges of the lectern, the grain of the wood biting into my palms, anchoring me. We live in a place that prides itself on its history. We talk about the buildings we've preserved, the traditions we keep, the names we carve into bronze plaques. But tonight, I want to talk about the things we often forget to protect. I want to talk about the true cost of a legacy. I looked directly at Marcus. He was leaning against a pillar now, his arms crossed, a slight, condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man who thought he was watching a play, unaware that he was the subject of the tragedy. "A legacy isn't a building or a bank account," I continued, my voice growing in volume, filling the cracks in the silence. "A legacy is the skin we live in, the stories we pass down, and the sacred trust we place in the hands of the next generation. We assume that those who share our blood will be the ones to carry our light when we grow tired. But what happens when that light is seen as a liability? What happens when a person's entire life, their memories, their dignity, the very roof over their heads, is reduced to a line item on a balance sheet?" The room was deathly silent now. The quartet had stopped playing, their bows frozen over the strings. The only sound was the wind rattling the high, arched windows, a cold reminder of the night outside. Marcus's smirk had vanished. His jaw had tight, and I watched his posture shift from relaxed to predatory. He sensed the change in the air, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the neighbors began to look from me to him. I met two people recently, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They had given everything to this town. They had built a home, raised a son, and contributed to the very fabric of our lives for 50 years. And in their hour of need, when the world became a little too fast and their steps a little too slow, they were met not with care but with a cold, calculated betrayal. They were told their home was no longer theirs. They were told they were a burden, a problem to be solved with a signature and a quiet exit. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were finally still. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me, the kind of clarity that comes only when you have nothing left to lose. I connected the device to the sound system I'd spent 2 hours testing that afternoon. We don't have to guess what was said behind closed doors, I told the crowd, my eyes locked on Marcus's ashen face. Because the truth has a way of finding its own voice even when we try to bury it. I pressed play. The speakers crackled for a heartbeat, a burst of static that made everyone flinch, and then Marcus's voice filled the hall. It was distorted by the recording, but unmistakable, that sharp, arrogant tone stripped of its public polish. They're incontinent liabilities, Sarah. Do you have any idea what the upkeep on that Victorian tomb costs? They're lucky I'm even finding them a place with a decent meal plan. They don't need a house, they need a room with a wipeable floor. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room, leaving everyone gasping. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face, leaving him a sickly, mottled gray. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, but for the first time in his life, he didn't find an audience or an ally. He found a wall of visceral, quiet disgust. He saw the people he had grown up with, the people he had looked down upon from his mountain of stolen equity, seeing him for exactly what he was. Earlier today, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy stillness like a blade, a legal injunction was filed in the county court. The deed transfer for the Miller estate has been frozen pending a full investigation into fraud, coercion, and elder financial abuse. Arthur and Martha Miller aren't going anywhere. They are staying in their home. And they aren't going to be alone because this community, the people in this room who actually remember what it means to be a neighbor, are going to make sure of it. I stepped down from the podium. My legs felt like lead and my vision was slightly blurred by the sudden rush of adrenaline, but I didn't stop until I was standing between Arthur and Martha. I took their hands, feeling the papery skin of Arthur's palm and the desperate, clutching strength in Martha's. Marcus tried to speak. He took a step forward, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, a frantic protest forming on his lips. This is a misunderstanding. You're taking things out of context. But no one was listening. As he tried to move toward the center of the room, the crowd didn't part for him with the usual deference. They simply turned their backs. One by one, shoulders shifted, bodies moved, and a literal wall of people formed between the son and the parents he had tried to discard. Conversations resumed, not in the polite hum of before, but in low, fierce whispers of outrage. The man who thought he owned the world, who thought he could buy his way out of his own inhumanity, was suddenly invisible in his own town. He stood there for a moment, isolated in the middle of the floor before he turned and fled toward the exit, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. I felt Martha's hand squeeze mine, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes wet with tears that weren't born of grief, but of a terrifying, beautiful relief. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were standing, and for the first time since Elias died, I didn't feel like a widow struggling to keep her head above water. I felt like a woman who had finally learned how to command the storm. The air in the hall changed instantly. It was as if a fever had broken, the collective shame of the room dissolving into a fierce, protective heat. People who had looked away from the Millers for weeks, perhaps out of discomfort or the mistaken belief that it was a private family matter, now rushed forward. Mrs. Higgins, who had lived 3 doors down from the Millers for 40 years, was the first to reach Martha, wrapping her in a thick hand-knitted shawl that smelled of lavender and old wool. I stood back then, my job as the shield momentarily over, watching as the community they had helped build finally rose to meet them. Leo and Mia were right there, too, their young faces solemn but bright with the realization that they had been part of something righteous. It wasn't just a lesson in justice for them. It was a lesson in the weight of a human soul and the power of a single recorded truth. The weeks that followed were a blur of fluorescent lights in lawyers' offices and the heavy, stale air of the county courthouse. Marcus didn't vanish quietly, men like him rarely do. He fought, his ego bruised far more than his conscience, but the recording was a ghost he couldn't exorcise. The legal system, often so slow and indifferent to the quiet tragedies of the elderly, seemed to find a sudden, sharp momentum in the face of such blatant cruelty. The deed was restored. The liabilities Marcus had spoken of were legally recognized as victims of a calculated theft. And by the time the first frost of November truly settled into the soil, Arthur and Martha were back in their hallway, standing beneath the chandelier that had seen 50 years of their lives. But the house felt different now. It was too large, its corners filled with the echoes of a betrayal that even a legal victory couldn't fully erase. One evening, after we had finished a quiet dinner of stew and bread at their massive mahogany table, Arthur looked at me, his eyes clear and tired. "It's too much house for 2 old ghosts, Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "We wanted our home back so we wouldn't be thrown away, but we don't need these walls to be who we are." That was when the idea took root. The large Victorian house, with its history and its newfound fame, was eventually sold to a young family who promised to fill the rooms with the noise of children and the chaos of growth. With the proceeds, and with a sense of peace I hadn't seen in them since the day I found them shivering in the cold, Arthur and Martha bought the small duplex that sat right against the fence of my own yard. It was a modest place, sun-drenched and easy to keep, but its true value lay in the 30 feet of grass that separated our back doors. Tonight, the transition feels complete. The legal battles are a memory filed away in dusty folders, and the town hall meeting has passed into local legend. My kitchen is small, but it has never felt more expansive. The steam from the teapot rises in a lazy curl, catching the golden light of the overhead lamp. Leo is showing Arthur something on a tablet, a bridge he's designing for a school project, and the old man is leaning in, his weathered hand resting on my son's shoulder, his expression one of rapt, genuine interest. Mia is helping Martha with the napkins, their heads bowed together in a quiet conspiracy of laughter. I stand by the stove for a moment, just breathing it in. For years, this house was a shrine to what I had lost. Every silence was a reminder of Elia's absence, every empty chair a testament to a future that had been stolen by a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon. I had been freezing, too, locked in a winter of my own making, convinced that my role in the world was simply to endure the cold until my children were grown. But looking at the Millers, seeing the way Arthur's eyes crinkle when he laughs and the way Martha's hands have stopped shaking, I realize I didn't just save their home. I saved the part of myself that had begun to freeze over in the cold of my own widowhood. I can feel Elias here. He isn't in the shadows or the silence anymore. He's in the warmth of the tea, the clink of the silverware, and the vibrant, living noise of a house that is full again. The cold is still out there, pressing against the window panes, but it can't get in. We have built a fortress of a different kind, not out of brick and mortar, but out of the simple, stubborn refusal to let anyone walk alone. I bring the teapot to the table, and as I sit down between my children and my neighbors, I realize that the silence isn't gone. It has just been transformed into peace.